The Galactic Integration Academy floated in the cold darkness of space, attached to Station Velar 7 like a bright jewel against the black void. Instructor Kethril walked through the curved hallways with her 4 slender arms folded behind her back, her pale blue skin catching the soft light from the ceiling panels above her. She had taught interspecies relations for over 40 cycles now, and she believed she understood every known sentient race in the galaxy. Her confidence in this belief was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The new student arrived on a transport ship from a distant arm of the galaxy, from a small blue planet called Earth that had only made contact with the wider universe 8 years ago. His name was Danny Cole, and he was 23 years old by the counting system of his homeworld. He was not impressive to look at by galactic standards. He stood at average height, with short dark hair and brown eyes that seemed to watch everything around him with quiet interest. He wore simple clothes and carried a single bag over his shoulder. The other students in Kethril's class came from powerful families across known space. There was a young Floraxian whose body was made of living plant matter, green and flexible, with leaves sprouting from her head instead of hair. There were 2 massive Gorth students, whose rocky gray bodies took up 3 seats each, their stone-like skin making them nearly impossible to harm. There were several quick and nervous Selkari, whose insect-like bodies clicked and chittered when they felt anxious about something. And now there was Danny Cole, sitting in the back row with that easy smile on his face. Kethril had reviewed his species file before class began. Humans were classified as a Class 4 species, which meant they were considered physically unremarkable in every measurable way. They had no natural armor to protect them from attacks. They had no venomous spines or poisonous glands to defend themselves. They had no telepathic abilities like Kethril's own Valorian people possessed. They could not regenerate lost limbs like the Selkari could. They could not photosynthesize energy from sunlight like the Floraxians. They were soft and fragile and slow compared to most other sentient species. The Galactic Council had actually considered classifying humans as a protected species when they first made contact, which would have meant other races had a legal duty to keep them safe from harm. The human representatives had politely declined this offer. Kethril should have wondered more about that refusal. She should have asked herself why a species so apparently weak would turn down free protection. But she had other things on her mind that day, so she simply began her lesson as planned. The topic was survival strategies across different planetary biomes. It was standard curriculum material, safe and straightforward. Kethril activated the holographic display at the front of the classroom, and images of various predators from across the galaxy appeared in the air. There were hunting beasts from high-gravity worlds with massive jaws and armored bodies. There were pack hunters from frozen planets that worked together to bring down prey many times their size. There were ambush predators from jungle worlds that could strike faster than most eyes could follow. The students watched with varying degrees of interest as Kethril explained how different species had evolved different methods to survive encounters with such creatures. She gestured with all 4 of her arms as she spoke, a habit she had developed over many years of teaching. "Today we will discuss predator evasion," she announced in her calm and measured voice. "All species have developed various methods to avoid becoming prey to dangerous creatures." She pointed to the Floraxian student with one hand. The Floraxians release chemical deterrents from their bodies that taste terrible to most predators. She gestured to the Selkari students with another hand. The Selkari can shed their limbs to escape from a predator's grip, then regrow those limbs over time. She indicated the massive Gorth students with a third hand. The Gorth rely on their nearly impenetrable hide to discourage attackers from even trying. The students nodded along with her words, familiar with their own species' survival mechanisms. Kethril smiled with satisfaction, and moved on to the assignment portion of the lesson. I want each of you to take out your tablets and list 3 ways your species has evolved to disable a predator long enough to escape from danger. The students began working on their answers, their fingers or appendages or tentacles tapping away at their screens. Kethril walked between the rows of desks, observing what they wrote. The Floraxian student listed toxin release, camouflage, and playing dead. All reasonable answers based on her species' biology. The Selkari students listed limb detachment, speed burst, and chemical spray. Again, accurate descriptions of their natural defenses. The Gorth students had simply written the word charge 3 times in a row. Kethril supposed that was technically accurate for a species that could knock down walls with their bodies. Then she reached Danny Cole's desk at the back of the room. He had not written anything on his tablet yet. Instead, he was looking up at her with a curious expression on his face, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Instructor Kethril," he said in a casual and friendly tone, "I have a clarifying question about the assignment, if you do not mind." "Of course, Mr. Cole," she replied, stopping beside his desk. "What would you like to know?" "When you say disable a predator," Danny said slowly, "do you mean temporarily or forever?" The classroom went completely silent in an instant. Every student stopped typing and turned to look at the human in the back row. Kethril felt both of her hearts skip a beat inside her chest. "I'm not sure I understand your question," she said carefully. "The assignment asks for evasion techniques, methods to escape from a predator so that you can survive the encounter." Danny nodded slowly, as if considering her words with great seriousness. "Right, but that seems kind of limiting, does it not?" he said. "I mean, if something is trying to eat me, I'm not really thinking about how to run away from it." He paused and looked around at his fellow students, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. "I'm thinking about how to make sure it never tries that again," he continued. "Not just with me, but with anyone." A Selkari student in the middle row made a high-pitched clicking sound of distress. Her mandibles were trembling visibly. Kethril felt a strange sensation crawling up her spine, something she had not experienced in many years of teaching students from dozens of different worlds. It took her a moment to recognize the feeling. It was unease. "Humans are not a predator species," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "According to your species file, you evolved as persistence hunters, but you lack the natural weapons of true apex predators. You have no claws or fangs or venom," she continued. "You have relatively weak bodies compared to dedicated predator species." Danny smiled at her words. It was not a threatening smile. It was friendly and warm and completely genuine. Somehow that made it much worse than a threatening smile would have. "With respect, instructor," he said in that same casual tone, "I think there might be some pretty big gaps in your data about my species." Kethril opened her mouth to respond, but she found that no words came out. She looked into Danny Cole's calm brown eyes and saw something there that she could not identify. It was not aggression, or hostility, or anger. It was something else entirely. It was patience. It was the look of a creature that had all the time in the world, and absolutely no intention of backing down from anything. The lesson continued after that, but Kethril found it difficult to concentrate on the material. She kept glancing at the human in the back row, wondering what exactly she had invited into her classroom. By the time the session ended and the students filed out, she had already decided to do more research on the species called humanity. She had a feeling that the files she had read were missing something very important. She was correct. Word spread through the academy like fire through dry grass in the days following that strange classroom moment. Students whispered to each other in hallways about the human who had asked whether predators should be disabled temporarily or forever. Instructors discussed it during their meal breaks in the faculty dining area. Even the maintenance workers who kept the station running had heard some version of the story by the end of the week. The Academy board called a meeting to discuss the situation. They were concerned about what the humans' words might mean. They were even more concerned about what they did not understand. Senior Administrator Vothon presided over the meeting in the large conference chamber on the top level of the Academy. He was an elderly Gorth whose stone-gray hide was cracked and weathered with age, and he had served in his position for longer than most of the other board members had been alive, to attend and share her observations about the human student. She told them about Danny Cole's question and the strange feeling it had given her. She told them about the look in his eyes. She admitted that she did not fully understand what she had witnessed. The board discussed various options for nearly 2 hours before reaching a decision. They wanted a demonstration. They wanted to see what humans were actually capable of doing. Danny Cole agreed to participate when they asked him. He seemed almost amused by the whole situation, as if he found their confusion entertaining in some gentle way. The demonstration was scheduled for the following day in the Academy's physical assessment chamber. This was a large arena, typically used for testing the capabilities of different species. It had sensors and measuring equipment built into every surface. Half the student body found excuses to attend the event. Council observers arrived from the nearby diplomatic station, their expressions carefully neutral as they took their seats in the observation area. Kethril stood on the raised observation platform with Vothon, looking down at the arena floor below. Danny Cole stood in the center of the space, wearing simple exercise clothing. He looked small and ordinary, surrounded by all that empty space. A team of Academy safety officers had set up various testing stations around the perimeter of the arena. There were speed measurement devices and strength testing equipment, and reflex assessment tools. Everything was ready to measure the human's physical capabilities. The first test was simple. A target would appear somewhere in the arena, and Danny had to reach it as quickly as possible. He was not fast. The readouts showed his speed at roughly average for a mid-tier species, nothing impressive at all. Laughed at the results. The second test measured his physical strength. He lifted weights and pushed against resistance panels, while the sensors recorded his output. His strength scores were similarly unimpressive. A Gorth child could have lifted more than he did. More laughter came from the watching students. The third test evaluated his reflexes and reaction time. Lights would flash at random locations, and he had to respond to them as quickly as possible. He performed reasonably well on this test, maybe in the top 30% of species that had been evaluated using this equipment. But still nothing remarkable or frightening or worthy of all this attention. Vothon made a satisfied rumbling sound deep in his stone chest. "You see," he said to Kethril in a low voice, "the human is clearly just boastful about his species, nothing more. They barely have proper spaceflight technology." Dismissively. "Their planet only made contact with the galaxy 8 years ago. We have been worrying about nothing." Kethril did not respond immediately. She was watching Danny Cole, who was looking up at the observation platform with an expression she could not quite read. Then he called out to them, in a clear voice that carried across the arena, "Can we get to the actual test now?" Kethril leaned forward and activated her communicator device. "What do you mean, Mr. Cole?" she asked. "What test are you referring to?" Danny spread his arms wide to indicate the equipment surrounding him. "I mean, you are testing me like I am an animal," he said. "You are measuring how fast I can run, and how hard I can hit, and how quickly I can react to a flashing light." He dropped his arms and looked directly at her. "That is not what makes humans dangerous," he said. "That has never been what makes us dangerous." The laughter in the observation area faded into uncertain silence. "Then please explain to us what does make your species dangerous," Kethril said. Danny nodded and began walking around the arena. picking up various items as he went. He grabbed a simple metal rod from one of the testing stations. He found a piece of cloth near a maintenance area. He located a small container of cleaning solvent on a supply cart near the wall. 3 things, he said, holding up the items he had collected. First, we make tools. He wrapped the cloth around one end of the metal rod, twisting it tight to hold it in place. Then he poured the cleaning solvent over the cloth until it was thoroughly soaked. A safety officer nervously handed him an ignition device when he asked for one. Moments later, Danny Cole held a burning torch in his hand, flames dancing at the end of the metal rod. Fire was not a weapon until we made it. 1, he said, watching the flames with calm eyes. Neither was a rock or a stick or a piece of sharpened bone. He set the torch down carefully in a safe location and continued speaking. Second, we adapt to any situation we find ourselves in. We change our tactics and our tools and our strategies based on what we are facing. There is no single approach that works against us, because we do not stick to a single approach ourselves. He walked to the center of the arena and stood there, looking up at all the observers watching him. Third, and this is the most important thing you need to understand about humans. He paused to make sure everyone was paying attention. We do not have an off switch. The arena was completely silent now. Even the environmental systems seemed to have gone quiet. Every species in this room has a survival instinct, Danny continued. A voice in your head that tells you when to run. Away, P. When the threat is too big to fight. When the odds are too bad to even try. When the smart choice is to retreat and survive to see another day. He smiled, that friendly and warm smile again. Humans broke that instinct about 200,000 years ago. We burned it out of ourselves through countless generations of refusing to give up. If a predator comes for a human, we do not calculate the odds of success. We do not run a cost-benefit analysis in our heads. We do not decide whether the fight is winnable before we engage. His eyes swept across the council observers in their fancy seats. We ask ourselves one question and one question only. How do I make sure this never happens again? Not just to me, but to anyone I care about. Not just today, but forever. The weight of his words settled over the arena like a heavy blanket. You asked me to list 3 ways to disable a predator, Instructor Kethril. I could not answer your question because the number is not 3. The number is infinite. We will find a way or we will make one. And whether the predator gets disabled temporarily or forever depends entirely on how much it annoys us in the process. He stood there in the center of the arena, small and soft and fragile looking. But somehow he seemed larger than the massive Gorth sitting in the observation area. Somehow he seemed more dangerous than any creature with claws or fangs or armor. Kethril finally understood what she had seen in his eyes during that classroom moment. It was not patience after all. It was certainty. The absolute and unshakable certainty of a species that had decided long ago that it would never be prey. No matter what the cost, no matter how long it took, no matter what had to be done. The demonstration ended shortly after that. Conversations it sparked would continue for a very long time. After the demonstration in the arena, Kethril found that she could not stop thinking about what she had witnessed. The image of Danny Cole standing there, with his improvised torch, kept appearing in her mind at odd moments. His words echoed through her thoughts when she tried to sleep. She decided that she needed to learn more about humanity if she was ever going to understand them. The Academy archives contained information about every known sentient species in the galaxy. Kethril had access to the deepest levels of the database due to her position as a senior instructor. She began her research late one evening and did not stop for 3 full days. What she discovered kept her awake through all of those long hours. She had known in a general way that humans had violence in their past. Most species did, after all. The Gorth had their ancient territorial wars that had scarred entire continents of their homeworld. Had their shameful history of telepathic purges when they had used their mental powers to destroy rivals. Even the peaceful Floraxians had engaged in chemical warfare with competing plant species millions of years ago. Violence was a common thread through the history of nearly every intelligent race. But humans were different from all of them. They had not just participated in wars with each other. They had turned war into a science. They had built factories to produce weapons and trained entire populations to fight. They had developed strategies and tactics and doctrines that they passed down through generations. They had made violence efficient in ways that other species had never imagined. And that was just what they had done to each other. What they had done to the other creatures on their planet was somehow even more disturbing. Kethril found records of the predators that had once lived on Earth alongside humanity. There had been great cats with powerful jaws and sharp claws that could kill with a single bite. There had been massive bears that stood taller than 2 humans and weighed more than 10. There had been wolves that hunted in coordinated packs, working together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. There had been sharks in the oceans that had ruled the waters for millions of years before humans existed. There had been crocodiles that had survived unchanged through countless ages because they were so perfectly designed for killing. All of these creatures should have been terrifying threats to a soft and slow species like humanity. Instead, the humans had hunted them, not out of fear or desperation, not because they needed food and had no other options. They had hunted the predators of their world out of something that Kethril could only describe as offended pride. Human and sea meal had apparently been so insulting to them that they had spent thousands of years making sure it could never happen. The great cats were mostly gone now, surviving only in small numbers in carefully controlled areas. The massive bears had been pushed to the edges of the habitable zones on their planet. The wolves had been hunted so thoroughly that humans had eventually felt guilty about it and started trying to bring them back. The sharks still swam in the oceans, but in far fewer numbers than before. The crocodiles survived because they lived in places humans did not particularly want. Every major predator on Earth existed now only because humans allowed them to. The humans had won so completely that they had become the ones who decided which of their former enemies would survive. And they had not stopped with the large, obvious predators. Kethril found records of humanity's war against the microscopic threats as, well, the bacteria and viruses that had killed countless humans throughout their history. These invisible predators had seemed invincible for most of human existence. They could not be fought with weapons or hunted with traps. They struck without warning and killed without mercy. For thousands of years, humans had simply died from these attacks, unable to understand what was killing them. Then humans had discovered what these microscopic predators actually were, and they had immediately declared war on them too. They had developed medicines and vaccines and treatments. They had built hospitals and research facilities dedicated entirely to fighting these tiny enemies. They had shared knowledge across their entire species, so that every human could benefit from what any human learned. One by one, the great plagues that had terrorized humanity for generations were brought under control. Smallpox, a disease that had killed hundreds of millions of humans, was completely eliminated. Polio was nearly gone. Measles and tuberculosis and countless other killers were being systematically hunted down. The humans were winning their war against enemies so small that they could not even be seen without special equipment. Kethril also found a concept in the archives that she had never encountered before. The humans had a word for something that no other species had ever needed to name. They called it spite. It meant the willingness to harm yourself in order to harm an enemy more. the willingness to accept your own destruction if it meant your opponent would be destroyed as well, the willingness to lose everything as long as your enemy lost more. No other species in the galactic database had a word for this idea. No other species had ever needed one. The concept was so alien to most forms of intelligent life that it had required extensive explanation in the human cultural files. Why would any creature choose to be harmed when it could avoid harm by simply backing down? Why would any being accept death when survival was an option? The answer, according to the human files, was that backing down meant the enemy would try again. It meant the enemy would see weakness and press their advantage. It meant others would suffer in the future because you had chosen safety in the present. Humans had decided somewhere in their distant past that this was not acceptable. They had decided that some things were worth dying for. They had decided that making an enemy regret their aggression was more important than personal survival. Kethril found records of human soldiers throwing themselves onto explosive devices to save their companions. She found stories of humans starving themselves to death in order to make political statements. She found accounts of humans walking into certain death, not to win, but simply to prove that they could not be made to surrender. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring and deeply confusing all at once. She finally understood why the Galactic Council had not classified humans as a protected species. It was not because humans did not seem to need protection based on their physical capabilities alone. It was because the Council was afraid of what humans might do to anyone who threatened that protection. A protected species was one that other races had a duty to defend and shelter from harm. Making humans a protected species would mean that anyone who harmed a human would face consequences from the entire galactic community. The Council had looked at human history and realized something important. Humans did not need the galaxy to avenge them if they were harmed. Humans would avenge themselves, thoroughly and completely and without mercy, and they would make absolutely certain that whatever had harmed them would never have the chance to harm anyone else ever again. Kethril closed the archive files after 3 days of reading. She felt like she understood something fundamental about the universe that she had never grasped before. The galaxy was full of predators of all shapes and sizes. Some had claws, and some had fangs, and some had poison, and some had overwhelming strength. But there was one predator that was more dangerous than all the others combined. It was small and soft and slow, and it came from a little blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. And it had decided a very long time ago that it would never be prey, no matter what stood against it, no matter how impossible the odds seemed, no matter what it had to become in order to survive. Kethril looked out her window at the stars beyond the station. Somewhere out there, Earth was spinning through the void, home to 8 billion of the most terrifying creatures the galaxy had ever produced. She wondered if the rest of the universe truly understood what was coming for them. She suspected they did not. The Krath arrived at Station Valar 7, without any warning, on what humans would have called a Tuesday afternoon. Their ships appeared on the sensor screens only moments before they began their attack, dropping out of faster-than-light travel so close to the station that the defense systems had almost no time to react. The Krath were a raider species that had terrorized this region of the galaxy for centuries. They had never been formally accepted into the galactic community because they refused to follow the basic rules of civilized interaction between species. They attacked colonies and trade ships and took whatever they wanted. They captured people for ransom or for sale to illegal labor markets. They killed anyone who resisted them too effectively. The Galactic Council tolerated their existence because fighting them would be expensive and dangerous, as long as the Krath limited their attacks to unaffiliated settlements and minor trade routes. The Council looked the other way. It was easier to let them take what they wanted than to pay the price of stopping them. The Krath themselves were terrifying creatures by any reasonable standard. They came from a high-gravity world that had produced bodies built for strength and violence. A typical Krath warrior stood 3 meters tall, with thick armored plates covering most of their body. Their claws could tear through standard hull plating with minimal effort. Their jaws could crush bones and metal alike. They had evolved as apex predators on a world that made Earth look like a peaceful garden. No one knew why they chose to attack the Academy that day. Perhaps they wanted hostages from wealthy and powerful families that they could ransom for enormous sums. Perhaps they wanted to make a statement to the Galactic Council about their power and reach. Perhaps they were simply bored and looking for easy prey in an unexpected location. Whatever their reason, they did not know that a human was aboard the station. Kethril was in her private quarters, grading student assignments, when the alarms began screaming through the corridors. She felt the station shudder beneath her feet as the Krath boarding craft latched onto the outer hull. Her telepathic senses were immediately overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through the station. She could feel the terror of her students as they realized what was happening. She could feel the panic of the staff members who had never experienced violence in their lives. She could feel the cold and hungry anticipation of the Krath themselves as they prepared to breach the hull and begin their hunt. And she felt something else, coming from the section of the station where Danny Cole was quartered. It was not fear. It was not anger, or determination, or resolve. It was something she had never sensed from any species before. It took her several moments to identify the emotion. It was excitement. The Krath cut through the hull near the student dormitories, exactly as their tactics suggested they would. 12 warriors came through the breach, armed with plasma blades that could slice through armor, and projectile weapons that could tear bodies apart. They expected to find cowering prey huddled in corners, waiting to be collected. They expected to take hostages without any meaningful resistance. They did not expect to find Danny Cole waiting for them. He had positioned himself in a corridor junction that led to a group of dormitory rooms. 3 other students were behind him, sheltering in an alcove that offered some protection from projectile fire. There was a young Floraxian named Petal, whose leaves were trembling with terror. There was a Selkari named Chirik, whose mandibles were clicking so fast they made a continuous buzzing sound. Was a juvenile Gorth named Braun, who was barely larger than Danny himself, and whose rocky hide had not yet hardened to its full adult strength. 4 young people facing 12 Krath warriors. The odds were not just bad, they were impossible. The Krath leader stepped forward and looked at the small group blocking his path. He saw a human, a plant creature, an insect, and a baby rock. He threw back his head and laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed through the corridor. "Move aside, little creatures," he growled in heavily accented Galactic Standard. "Give us no trouble, and you might survive this day." Danny did not move aside. Instead, he spoke in a calm and steady voice that seemed completely inappropriate for the situation. "Stay behind me," he said to the 3 students. "If any of them get past me, I want you to run as fast as you can. Do not try to fight, just run." Chirik made a distressed clicking sound. "Are 12 of them," she said, her voice high with panic. "I can see that," Danny replied. "You cannot defeat 12 Krath warriors," Chirik continued. "I know." Danny reached out and pulled a fire extinguisher from its mounting bracket on the wall nearby. It was a heavy steel cylinder designed to be permanently attached to the station structure. He hefted it in his hands, testing its weight and balance. "I do not need to defeat them," he said. "I just need to hurt them badly enough that they decide we are not worth the trouble." Petal spoke up in a trembling voice from behind him. "Humans do not have natural weapons," she said. "I read the species files. They say humans are physically unremarkable." Danny looked at the fire extinguisher in his hands. Then he looked at a metal chair that was bolted to the floor nearby. Then he looked up at a lighting fixture that could be pulled from the ceiling with enough force. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We get that a lot." The craft leader stopped laughing. Something had changed in the air of that corridor. Something that triggered instincts buried deep in the predator's brain. Ancient memories stirred from before the craft had achieved true intelligence. Memories of small creatures on his homeworld that should have been easy prey, but somehow never were. Creatures that refused to run when they should have run. Creatures that fought back with whatever they could find. Creatures that made hunting them more trouble than it was worth. The warning flashed through his mind for just a moment. He ignored it and gave the order to attack. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Afterward, station security forces would review the recordings and watch them over and over again, trying to understand what they were seeing. They would watch Danny Cole swing that fire extinguisher like a club, smashing it into the knee joint of the first Krath warrior with enough force to shatter the armor plate protecting it. They would watch him dodge a plasma blade strike by dropping to the floor and rolling, then coming up with a metal chair leg he had broken off during the fall. They would watch him drive that improvised weapon into the gap between 2 armor plates on another warrior's torso. They would watch him take a claw strike across his ribs that should have opened him up like a package, but somehow only left him with broken bones instead of fatal wounds. They would watch him keep fighting even after that injury, even after a blow to his head left blood streaming down his face, even after his left wrist was clearly broken and hanging at a wrong angle. They would watch him scream at the craft in a language the translators could not process, words that seemed to mean nothing but carried meaning through pure rage and refusal. Most of all, they would watch the Krath warriors begin to hesitate. These were apex predators from a death world, trained from birth in the arts of violence. They had fought and killed members of dozens of different species across the galaxy. They had never seen anything like this human. The fight should have been over in seconds. Instead, the human kept getting back up. Every time they knocked him down, he rose again. Every time they wounded him, he just became more aggressive. He was not trying to win. He was trying to make victory cost them more than they were willing to pay. And it was working. 6 Krath warriors were dead when the remaining 6 finally retreated to their boarding craft and fled the station. 6 of the most dangerous predators in the galaxy killed by one human with a fire extinguisher and whatever else he could grab. Danny Cole was sitting against the wall when the security forces finally arrived. He had 3 broken ribs, fractured wrist, and a gash across his forehead that would leave a permanent scar. He was covered in blood, some of it his own, and some of it belonging to the Krath. But he was alive, and so were the 3 students he had protected. Petal and Chirik and Braun were unharmed, still huddled in their alcove, staring at the human who had just done the impossible right in front of their eyes. The Krath had not taken a single hostage from Station Valar 7, and they would never attack this station again, because now they knew what was waiting for them if they tried. The aftermath of the Krath attack changed everything for humanity and for the galaxy that had underestimated them. Within days of the incident, the Galactic Council held an emergency session to discuss what had happened on Station Valar 7. They reviewed the security recordings of the fight. They interviewed the students who had witnessed it. They consulted with military experts from a dozen different warrior species. Then they voted unanimously to upgrade humanity's species classification from Class 4 to Class 2. This placed humans alongside known warrior races like the Gorth and the Teth, species that had been fighting wars across the stars for thousands of years. Some council members argued that even Class 2 was not high enough. They suggested that humans should be given their own special classification, something that acknowledged how different they were from every other species. The motion did not pass, but the fact that it was even considered signaled a seismic shift for humanity's place in the galaxy. Proposed et al. Said something important. Anthropologists and researchers from dozens of worlds arrived at Earth to study humanity more closely. They wanted to understand how a species with no natural weapons had become so fundamentally dangerous. They wanted to know what made humans willing to fight against impossible odds. They wanted to learn the secrets that had allowed this seemingly unremarkable species to conquer their homeworld so completely. Danny Cole became famous throughout the known galaxy, though he seemed uncomfortable with all the attention. Reporters and journalists from countless media organizations wanted to interview him about his fight with the Krath. They wanted to know how he had felt during those 4 minutes of violence. They wanted to understand what had been going through his mind. When they asked him how he had managed to defeat 6 Krath warriors by himself, he just shrugged. They expected prey, he said. Simply, they were not prepared for something that would fight back no matter what. No predator ever is, really. That is why they become predators in the first place. They choose fights they know they can win. Humans choose fights we refuse to lose. There is a big difference between those two things. Kethril visited Danny in the medical ward on his last day before being discharged. He was sitting up in bed reading something on a tablet device, looking remarkably healthy for someone who had nearly died just 2 weeks earlier. His injuries were healing faster than the doctors had expected. Apparently, humans also had remarkable recovery capabilities that their species files had not adequately documented. "I owe you an apology," Kethril said as she entered the room. "For what exactly?" Danny looked up from his tablet with a surprised expression. "For underestimating your species from the very." She walked closer to his bed and sat down in a chair beside it. "For assuming that physical capabilities were all that mattered when evaluating how dangerous a species could be." She paused to gather her thoughts before continuing. "When I asked my class about disabling predators, I was thinking like a Valorian. I was thinking like someone who relies on telepathy and advanced technology to solve problems. I did not consider that there might be completely different approaches to the same challenge." Danny nodded slowly. "Most species do not consider that," he agreed. "That is okay, though. We are used to being underestimated. It usually works in our favor when things get serious." "But it is not okay," Kethril insisted. "The Krath have been raiding this region of the galaxy for centuries. No one has ever stopped them, because everyone assumes the cost would be too high. Easier to let them take what they want than to fight back against them." "And then what happened?" Danny waited for her to continue. "6 of them are dead because one human with no weapons decided that was not acceptable." She looked at him with an intensity that surprised even herself. "You could have hidden somewhere safe until security arrived. You could have let the Krath take the other students as hostages. Why did you choose to fight instead?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, staring at something only he could see. "On Earth," he finally said, "we have a concept that I do not think translates perfectly into galactic standard. The closest word would probably be neighbor. It means someone who lives near you, someone who shares your space and your community." "I understand what the word means," Kethril said. "No, you understand the definition of the word," Danny said. "Directly, the concept behind it is different and more complicated. On Earth, if something threatens your neighbor, it threatens you as well. Not because you live close to each other, not because you share resources or have mutual defense agreements, but because letting someone hurt your neighbor means they might try to hurt you next, or they might hurt someone else, or they might hurt the children of people you have never even met." He shifted in his bed, wincing slightly as his healing ribs protested. "Petal and Chirik and Braun were not my friends before that day. I had barely spoken to any of them, but they were my neighbors in the sense that matters. And when something comes for your neighbors, you do not calculate the odds first. You do not assess your capabilities and compare them to the threat. You pick up whatever is nearby, and you make that thing regret every decision that led it to this moment. Even if you might die trying, Kethril asked quietly, especially if you might die trying. Danny's eyes were distant, but his voice was firm. Because dying while fighting means you might take them with you. And the next predator that thinks about threatening your neighbors will remember what happened to the last one that tried. They will tell stories about it to warn each other. And maybe that story will save someone you will never meet from a danger you will never see. Kethril considered his words carefully. In all her years of teaching students from dozens of different worlds, she had never encountered a species with this philosophy. It seemed almost suicidally aggressive when viewed from the outside, but it also explained so many things. It explained why Earth still had humans living on it, despite all the predators and diseases and disasters. It explained why humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed them. It explained why every predator that had ever looked at humans as prey had eventually been driven to extinction or complete submission. Humans did not just refuse to become victims themselves. They refused to allow victory to be possible for anything that threatened what they cared about. I think I need to revise my curriculum, Kethril said slowly. Danny laughed and then winced as his ribs complained again. What are you planning to change? The question about predators. She stood up from her chair. I am going to add a new component to the assignment. I am going to ask my students what they would do if running away was not an option. What would they do if surrender just meant the predator would find new prey somewhere else? What would they do if the only way to ensure safety was to make the predator too afraid to ever try again? Danny admitted, I know it is. She paused at the door and turned back to look at him. I suspect most of my students will not have an answer to that question. But I also suspect that the ones who do will be the ones worth paying attention to. Worth paying attention to why? The galaxy is very large, Mr. Cole, and there are many predators living in it. Perhaps it is time we stopped running from all of them. She inclined her head respectfully toward him. Perhaps it is time we took a more human approach to the problem. She left him there in his medical bed, reading his tablet and healing from wounds he had earned while protecting strangers who had not been his friends. The academy returned to its normal routine in the weeks that followed. Students attended their classes and instructors taught their lessons. Life continued as it always had on Station Valar 7. Stars. The surviving craft were telling stories to anyone who would listen. Stories about a species that should have been easy prey. A species with no claws or fangs or armor or venom. A species that had killed 6 of their best warriors using a fire extinguisher and a broken chair. The stories spread across the galaxy like ripples in a pond. They reached the allies of the Krath and the enemies of the Krath and everyone in between. They reached every predator species that had ever considered humans to be potential prey. And sooner or later, all of those species would learn what Instructor Kethril had learned in her classroom and in the archives and in the medical ward. When a human asks whether you want to be disabled temporarily or forever, the only wise answer is to apologize and walk away, because humans do not have an off switch, and they never ever forget what tried to hurt them.